There is a version of the Ice Age that lives in your head right now, and it's probably wrong. You're picturing a woolly mammoth, maybe a saber-tooth tiger, some snow, some fur-wearing humans huddled around a fire looking pretty pleased with themselves, spear in hand, standing over a kill. Like conquering heroes. We love this story. The man, the apex predator narrative is deeply flattering, and it feeds directly into old anthropological ideas like the killer ape hypothesis, which basically argued our ancestors were born dominant, aggressive, and unstoppable the second they figured out how to sharpen a stick. But the fossil record tells a very different story. For nearly 2 million years, we weren't just hunters. We were hunted constantly. Our bite force sits at a pathetic 120 to 160 pounds per square inch. We have no venom, no natural armor, no retractable claws. A big-brained, weak-limbed ape wandering alone was an easy meal for an enormous list of animals that looked like they walked straight out of a horror movie. Today we're going deep into the specific predators that made life genuinely miserable for our ancestors across the Pleistocene, the epoch that ran from about 2.58 million years ago to roughly 11,700 years ago. I also want to set the scene a little because the word Ice Age tends to flatten everything into one single, snowy, monolithic period. In reality, the Pleistocene cycled through a series of glacial and interglacial periods, meaning the climate swung between brutally cold stretches with massive ice sheets and warmer, more temperate windows where forests and grasslands crept back in. The animals we're about to cover weren't just surviving in snowdrifts. They were apex predators across an enormous range of environments, from African savanna to the open steppe of Ice Age Europe to the grasslands of North America, and hominins were moving straight through all of it, trying to find food, water, and shelter in exactly the same places these animals wanted those things too. On to the leopard. You'd think something dramatic like a saber-tooth would be our biggest problem historically, but the animal with the single most consistent, most damning body of evidence against it is the leopard, Panthera pardus. Back in the 1970s, a paleoanthropologist named Charles Kimberlin Bob Brain, who held a PhD in zoology and geology, so his name was genuinely Dr. Brain, was digging through the Swartkrans cave deposits in South Africa. He pulled out a partial hominin skull, catalogued as SK54, dating back roughly 1.8 to 1.9 million years. On both the left and right parietal bones were 2 puncture marks. Those marks matched almost perfectly against the canines of a leopard fossil found in the exact same cave deposit, which is essentially the paleontological equivalent of finding the murder weapon still sitting at the crime scene. Dr. Brain published these findings in a 1981 monograph titled The Hunters or the Hunted, and the question in the title was a genuinely open one at the time. For most of the early 20th century, we assumed our ancestors were the dominant species in their environment. Brain's taphonomic work, meaning the study of how remains decay and fossilize, suggested something far more humbling. Across Swartkrans and virtually every major hominin site in South Africa, the pattern repeats. Leopards were regularly preying on hominins across the region for well over 1 million years, and doing it consistently enough to leave a signature in the fossil record. 5% of all known Australopithecus afarensis fossils show evidence of having been eaten by something. Here's the detail that makes this even stranger. Leopards have a habit of dragging their kills up into trees to keep them safe from scavengers like hyenas. Over thousands of years, those remains eventually fall from the branches into the cave systems below, and that's where they fossilize. A meaningful portion of our most important early hominin fossils exist specifically because a leopard dragged one of our ancestors up a tree to eat in peace. Picture it. You're a Homo ergaster out foraging for tubers in the late afternoon. You're focused on the ground, not the canopy above you. You never hear the 150-pound cat drop from the branch until its jaws are already locked around your neck, closing with somewhere around 300 to 400 psi, more than enough to shatter your spine on the spot. The species responsible for the SK54 marks, by the way, is a modern leopard, one that still exists today and still occasionally comes into conflict with people in India and Nepal, where settlements closely border natural habitat. On to the giant hyena, Pachyrhocutta brevirostris. The giant, short-faced hyena was built on a scale that's genuinely hard to picture. Imagine a modern hyena, except sized up to roughly that of a female lion, weighing around 110 kilograms, or about 240 pounds. Its skull was reinforced, and its premolar teeth carried thick, specially structured enamel built for one specific job: cracking bone. Any bone, yours included. These animals were mostly kleptoparasitic scavengers, meaning they'd wait for another predator to make a kill, then use their sheer size to intimidate the actual hunter off its own meal. But we have direct evidence they ate us too, actively hunted or otherwise. A roughly 500,000-year-old early human femur recovered from Thomas Quarry. 1. An archaeological site in Morocco shows bite marks entirely consistent with predation or scavenging by this exact species. Your femur, the strongest bone in your body, requires somewhere around 4,000 newtons of force to break. Pachycracuta could exceed that with a single bite. If you got separated from your group and one of these things caught your scent, it would not hesitate to run you down and crack you open for the marrow inside. Onto the saber-tooths. There are two worth separating out here: Megantereon and Dinofelis. Dinofelis is often nicknamed the false saber-tooth, belonging to an entirely separate, now extinct family of predators, distinct from true felines like lions and Megantereon. Dinofelis ranged across Africa, Europe, and Asia, and survived until roughly 1.2 million years ago, meaning it fully overlapped with our early ancestors. It was roughly jaguar-sized, somewhere between 70 and 120 kilograms, with disproportionately powerful forelimbs. Carbon isotope analysis of its teeth suggests it actually preferred grazing animals over primates, so while it could, and occasionally did, eat a hominin, it likely wasn't hunting us specifically as often as its more infamous cousin. That cousin is Megantereon, a true saber-tooth in the same family as modern cats. We have a famous 1.8 million-year-old skull from Dmanisi, Georgia, catalogued as D2280, belonging to an early Homo erectus. On the back of that skull, the occipital bone, are bite marks that match the dimensions of Megantereon's elongated canines almost exactly. Picture the scene. You're part of a small Homo erectus group. You're smart, you're coordinated, but you're physically outmatched by almost everything around you. A solitary 200-pound Megantereon isn't interested in fighting your whole group, so it waits in tall grass. You step away from the fire at night to relieve yourself just 5 feet outside the light. In a fraction of a second, pure muscle is on top of you. Rather than crushing your windpipe the way a modern lion might, it uses those long serrated canines to slice cleanly through the major vessels in your neck. You bleed out within seconds. Efficient, almost surgical. On to Smilodon, the most famous saber-tooth of them all, since we can't talk about this family without mentioning the headliner. Smilodon fatalis weighed between 350 to 620 pounds, depending on the subspecies, with canines reaching up to 7 inches long. Its build was stocky and powerful, more suited to close ambush than long chases, using raw upper body strength to pin prey before delivering a killing bite to the throat or belly, rather than the skull, since those canines were actually fairly fragile under lateral, sideways stress. Dental microwear studies on Smilodon teeth show heavy wear patterns consistent with an animal that dealt with a lot of struggling prey up close. Exactly the kind of detail you didn't need to know, but now do anyway. Onto the American lion. Panthera atrox, commonly called the American lion, despite not technically being the same species as a modern African lion, was the largest true cat to ever exist. Males are estimated at 350 to 500 pounds, roughly 25% larger than a modern African lion, standing about 4 feet at the shoulder and stretching over 8 feet long without the tail. Its bite force has been estimated at around 1,800 pounds per square inch based on skull width calculations, more than double that of a modern lion. Panthera atrox ranged from Alaska down through Central America, meaning any hominin population moving through those corridors during the Pleistocene would have shared territory with it directly. Fossils recovered from the La Brea tar pits show bite and claw evidence on the bones of other large mammals, consistent with an apex predator that did not particularly care what species it was interrupting on its way to dinner. On to the scimitar-toothed cat, Homotherium, which doesn't get nearly the attention its cousin Smilodon does, and that's a crime, because it might have been more dangerous to us specifically. Unlike the stocky, ambush-built Smilodon, Homotherium had longer legs, a more cursorial, running-adapted build, and canines that were shorter but wickedly serrated, like little steak jackknives. Some researchers have proposed it hunted in coordinated groups, going after young mammoths and mastodon calves. A 2020 study published in Current Biology, examining the extinction timeline of Homotherium across continents, found that the species went extinct in Africa earlier than Europe, and in Europe earlier than North America, a pattern the researchers linked to the expanding brain size and population of genus Homo in each respective region. As hominins got smarter and more numerous, Homotherium's numbers seemed to drop. Homotherium coexisted with both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens in Europe for a documented stretch of up to 200,000 years in some regions, which is not a brief cameo. That's a very long-term roommate situation, except the roommate occasionally eats your children. On to dire wolves. Since I know you've heard the name and you're picturing something out of a fantasy show, Canis dirus wasn't enormous in terms of height compared to modern wolves, but it was heavier and more robust, with a skull built for crushing bone, similar in logic to the hyenas we've already covered, weighing around 130 to 150 pounds on the high end and hunting in coordinated packs. Dire wolves represented less of a single dramatic threat and more of a numbers problem. One confused hominin wandering too far from the group, a pack of a dozen dire wolves nearby, and you understand very quickly why staying close to your people was never just a nice suggestion. On to the cave hyena, which deserves way more attention than it usually gets. Crocuta spelaea, the Ice Age spotted hyena, was genetically nearly identical to the spotted hyenas still roaming sub-Saharan Africa today, just adapted for a much colder European range. These hyenas lived in Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula through to Asia. For the entire time, Neanderthals were establishing themselves on the continent. Research examining Neanderthal and cave hyena remains shows both species competing directly over the same prey, mainly bovids, horses, and deer, and fighting over the same real estate, caves. Multiple European sites show alternating layers of hyena occupation and Neanderthal occupation, like two roommates who never quite managed to coordinate a move-out date. Research has documented Neanderthal processed kills later scavenged by hyenas, meaning hyenas were, at least sometimes, stealing food directly from Neanderthal groups. Flip that scenario around, and you can guess who occasionally lost a direct confrontation over territory or a fresh kill. Cave hyena populations only started declining around 20,000 years ago and went extinct in Europe by roughly 11,000 to 14,000 years ago. On to the cave lion, Panthera spelaea, cousin to the American lion, but ranging across Ice Age Europe and Asia instead of the Americas. Roughly the size of a modern lion, maybe slightly larger. Cave lions coexisted with both cave hyenas and early hominins for a documented stretch of at least 200,000 years in some regions. Cave paintings from sites like Chauvet Cave in France, dated to around 30,000 to 32,000 years old, depict cave lions in detail, hunting in what look like coordinated groups, which tells us something fascinating. Early Homo sapiens were watching these animals closely enough and were around them often enough to paint accurate behavioral studies of them on cave walls. That's not a distant abstract threat. That's a neighbor. On to the crocodile. Did you think water was safer? It wasn't. Crocodilus anthropophagus, discovered by researchers from the University of Iowa and described from fossils found in Tanzania's Olduvai Gorge, has a name derived from the Greek anthropos, meaning human, and phagus, meaning eater. The man-eating crocodile. This creature lived alongside Homo habilis and Paranthropus boisei roughly 1.84 million years ago, sharing the exact same gorge at the exact same time. It measured around 25 feet, roughly the length of a telephone pole laid flat, and weighed up to 2 tons. Fossilized leg bones from at least 2 separate hominins recovered from Olduvai carry crocodilian tooth marks dating to the same window as this species. Water is non-negotiable. Every single day, no matter how dangerous the walk to the river is, you have to go back and drink. Camouflaged, patient, holding its breath in the shallows, a 2-ton reptilian relative of the dinosaurs would wait for exactly that moment. It didn't need to chase you. It needed you to bend down. One violent thrash, a bite force well north of 5,000 pounds per square inch clamping around your torso, and a death roll separating limbs from body before you'd even processed what was happening. Onto the short-faced bear. When hominins eventually crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America, somewhere around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. They ran into a completely new category of predator that had never encountered a primate before. Arctodus simus, the giant short-faced bear, standing on its hind legs. This animal reached heights of up to 12 feet. It weighed up to roughly 2,000 pounds. Its skull was short and disproportionately wide, giving it an almost alien, crushing profile, and its legs were unusually long, built for genuine speed rather than the lumbering gait we associate with bears today. Some estimates put its running speed at up to 40 miles per hour in short bursts. Isotope analysis suggests Arctodus leaned heavily toward scavenging, but that's cold comfort. If an early Paleo-Indian group successfully brought down a mammoth or bison, an Arctodus could smell that blood from miles out, and a group of humans with stone-tipped spears was not stopping a ton of hyper-carnivore from muscling in, stealing the kill, and treating a person or two as an appetizer along the way. It was, without much competition, the biggest bully on the Pleistocene block in North America. Onto the sky, because the ground wasn't the only place death came from. A full-grown Homo sapien, or Homo erectus, wasn't getting carried off by a bird. Our children were a different story entirely. In 1924, Raymond Dart discovered the skull of the Taung child in South Africa, a roughly 3-year-old Australopithecus africanus. For decades, nobody could confirm exactly how the child died. Then in 2006, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger, after watching African crowned eagles hunt monkeys in the wild and studying the specific damage those birds leave behind, went back and re-examined the Taung skull under that new lens. He found puncture marks and ragged tearing at the base of the eye sockets, the orbits, along with matching scratches across the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital bones. These are the exact signature eagles leave when they use their talons and beaks to reach the eyes and brain of prey too small for a big cat to bother cracking open conventionally. The marks on Taung matched modern eagle kill damage, almost feature for feature. These birds were genuinely massive raptors, capable of hauling prey close to their own body weight. Picture a young hominin mother crouched over, digging up a root, setting her toddler down on the ground for 2 seconds while she works. A sudden rush of wind, a short shriek, and the child is simply gone, carried off over the tree line, never seen again. It's one of the more quietly devastating details in the entire fossil record. And finally, we have to talk about snakes. I genuinely love snakes, and it turns out snakes loved us right back. Every other predator on this list has left behind physical evidence: bite marks, puncture wounds, scratches on bone. Snakes are different. They swallow prey whole and leave no trace fossils behind. No bite marks on a skull, no obvious signature. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and what indirect evidence we do have paints a pretty clear picture. Researchers Thomas N. Headland and Harry W. Green published a detailed study available on PubMed examining exactly how dangerous constrictor snakes were to people living prehistoric adjacent lifestyles. Their research on the Agta Negritos, a modern hunter-gatherer group in the Philippines, found that 26% of adult male respondents had personally survived a predation attempt by a reticulated python. If a quarter of adult men in a modern forest-dwelling society have survived an attack from a giant snake, you can imagine what those odds looked like for a Homo habilis moving through dense undergrowth 2 million years ago with none of the tools or awareness that group had. Snake lineages capable of preying on primates trace back roughly 100 million years, meaning these predators were hunting our evolutionary ancestors 20 million years before primates even existed as a distinct group. So let's actually tally this up. We weren't the biggest, we weren't the fastest, our skin didn't stop teeth, and our raw physical strength was a joke compared to nearly everything on this list. In every meaningful sense, we were a slow-moving, two-legged buffet for the real apex predators of the Pleistocene. Here's a question worth asking, though. If all of these predators were this dangerous, why weren't hominins simply wiped out entirely across nearly 2 million years of exposure to them? The answer comes down to group behavior. A solo hominin standing alone in open grassland was absolutely a viable meal for an American lion, a pack of dire wolves, or a lurking Megantereon. A coordinated group of 20 to 30 hominins with fire, thrown weapons, and the willingness to make a lot of aggressive noise was a significantly less appealing option. Fire specifically appears to have been a genuine game-changer. Controlled fire use dating back roughly 1 million years, evidenced at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, would have provided a real deterrent against most Ice Age megafauna, predator or otherwise, since very few animals enjoy walking into flame just to get a snack. There's also the matter of scavenging versus hunting. A lot of these apex predators, especially Arctodus and the giant hyena, were likely more interested in stealing an existing carcass than actively hunting a group of armed, alert hominins. Getting into a fight with a group defending fresh meat costs energy and risks injury, and injury for a solitary Ice Age predator often meant a slow death from infection or starvation. Most large carnivores, then and now, generally prefer the path of least resistance. Unfortunately for isolated individuals, sick members, or small hunting parties caught off guard, that path of least resistance sometimes was them. Let's sit inside a hypothetical for a second, because I think it helps to feel this rather than just hear numbers. You're a Neanderthal, roughly 60,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now northern Spain. You've been tracking a wounded deer for hours, and your group has fallen behind because your youngest hunter twisted his ankle on loose scree. You're alone at the mouth of a shallow cave you don't recognize, and it's starting to get dark. You duck inside to wait out the cold, and immediately you smell something wrong, something musky and recently active. That low, guttural whooping sound echoing off the cave walls isn't the wind. It's a cave hyena clan, and you've just walked into their den uninvited. You back out slowly, heart pounding, and spend the night in the open instead, shivering, listening for footsteps, because the alternative was worse. This kind of split-second decision, made without fire, without a spear thrown yet, without your group nearby, is genuinely what survival looked like on a random Tuesday for most of our evolutionary history. So how are we the ones sitting here right now, watching YouTube videos, while giant hyenas and saber-tooth cats are dust in a museum drawer? Because we had something sharper than teeth. We had extreme social cohesion. We had complex communication. Our fear of loneliness is one of the most useful survival mechanisms built directly into our brains, and it goes back millions of years, because a big-brained ape wandering alone was a dead ape. 30 of us together was one of the most dangerous forces in the entire Pleistocene ecosystem. If a Megantereon or a leopard took one of us, the other 20 eventually figured out how to track it down. We used persistence hunting, coordinating with each other, leaning on our uniquely efficient ability to sweat and regulate body heat, and running a threat down over 15 miles until it physically collapsed from exhaustion. We survived because we took care of each other. The old, the sick, the very young. We protected them. We shared food. We built fire together, and we formed coalitions that pushed the monsters back into the dark. The formal hierarchies, the kings and queens and chains of command you're picturing, those came much later, tied to the agricultural revolution. For 95% of human history, we were just small, stubborn, egalitarian bands of apes who flatly refused to go extinct. And as for what eventually took down most of these terrifying predators themselves, the leading theory points to a combination of climate change at the end of the Pleistocene, the decline of mega-herbivore prey populations as glaciers retreated, and increasing competition from an increasingly organized, increasingly widespread genus Homo. Around 11,700 years ago, as the Ice Age wound down and the Holocene began, American lions, dire wolves, short-faced bears, cave hyenas, cave lions, and scimitar cats all disappeared within a relatively tight window of time. We, on the other hand, did not. Never forget how hard your ancestors had to fight just so you could exist today. Never stop ingesting as much education as you possibly can in this lifetime. Bye.